Section 6 of Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, 1871-1888. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, 1871-1888, by Francis Rowe. Section 6, Letters from 1873, Part 3. Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory, August, 1873. We have just come in from a drive to the Purgatoire with Colonel Knight behind his handsome horses. It makes me sad always to go over that familiar road, and to scenes that are so closely associated with my learning to ride and shoot when we were here before. The small tree that was my target is dead, but still standing, and on it are several little pieces of the white paper bullseyes that Fay and Lieutenant Baldwin tacked on it for me. We often see poor Tom. The post trader bought him after Lieutenant Baldwin's death, so the dear horse would always have good care and not be made to bring and carry for a cruel master. He wanders about as he chooses and is fat, but the coat that was once so silky and glossy is now dull and faded, and the horse looks spiritless and dejected. Poor Tom! The greyhound Magic still remembers their many, many hunts together, when the horse would try to outrun the dog, and the hound often goes out to make him little visits. And the sight is pathetic. That big dog of the chaplain's is still here, and how the good man can conscientiously have him about I cannot understand. Colonel Knight has two large dogs also, but they are shut in the stable most of the time to guard his pair of valuable horses. The horses are not particularly fast or spirited, but they are very beautiful and perfectly matched in color and gait. Ever since Hal has been old enough to run with a horse, he has always gone with me riding or driving. So the first time we drove with Colonel Knight, I called Hal to go with us, and he ran out of the house and over the fence with long, joyful bounds, to be instantly pounced upon and rolled over into the acequia by the two big dogs of Colonel Knight's that I had not even heard of. Hal has splendid fighting blood and has never shown cowardice, but he is still a young dog and inexperienced and no match for even one old fighter, and to have two notoriously savage, bloodthirsty beasts gnawing at him as though he was a bone was terrible. But Hal apparently never thought of running from them, and after the one howl of surprise gave his share of vicious growls and snaps. But the old dogs were protected by their heavy hair, while Hal's short coat and fine skin were easily torn. We all rushed to his rescue, for it looked as though he would be torn in pieces, and when I saw a long cut in his tender skin, I was frantic. But finally the two black dogs were pulled off, and Hal was dragged out of the ditch and back to the house, holding back and growling all the time, which showed plainly he was not satisfied with the way the affair had ended. The drive that day I did not enjoy. Hal was not torn so deeply as to have unsightly scars, for which I was thankful. From that day on, however, he not only hated those dogs, but disliked the man who cares for them, and seemed to consider him responsible for their very existence. And it was wonderful that he should recognize Cressy's step on the ground as he passed at the side of our house. Several times, when he would be stretched out on the floor, to all appearances fast asleep, I have seen him open his eyes wide and growl when the man and dogs were passing, although it was perfectly impossible for him to have seen them. One morning about 10 days ago, when I was on the second floor, I heard an awful noise downstairs. Whines, growls, and howls all so mingled together one would have thought there were a dozen dogs in the house. I ran down to see what could possibly be the matter, and found Hal at a window in the dining room that looked out on the back yard, every hair on his brindled back standing straight up and each white tooth showing. Looking out, I saw that Turk, the more savage of the two black dogs, was in the yard and could not get out over the high board fence. Cressy was probably on guard that day, and sentry over the prisoners who had brought water. The dog must have followed him in, and then managed to get left. Hal looked up at me, and for one instant kept perfectly still, waiting to see what I would do. His big brown eyes were almost human in their beseeching, and plainly said, "You cannot have forgotten. You will surely let me out." And let him out I did. I opened the doors leading to the yard, and, almost pushing me over, he rushed to the black dog, with great leaps and the most blood-curdling growls, jumping straight over him, then around him, then over him again and again, and so like a whirlwind, the poor black beast was soon crazy, for snap as fast as he might, it was ever at the clear, beautiful air. Hal was always just out of reach. After he had worried the dog all he wanted to, Hal proceeded to business. With a greyhound trick he swung himself around with great force and knocked the big dog flat upon the ground, and holding him down with his two paws, he pulled out mouthful after mouthful of long hair, throwing it out of his mouth right and left. If the dog attempted to raise his big head, Hal was quick to give a wicked snap that made the head fall down again. When I saw that Hal had actually conquered the dog, and had proved that he was the splendid hound I had ever considered him to be, I told West to go out at once and separate them. But for the very first time West was slow. He went like a snail. It seemed that one of the dogs had snapped at his leg once, and I believe he would have been delighted if Hal had gnawed the dog flesh and bone. He pulled Hal in by his collar and opened the gate for Turk, and soon things were quiet once more. All that day Hal's eyes were like stars, and one could almost see a grin on his mouth. He was ever on the alert, and would frequently look out on the yard, wag his tail, and growl. The strangest thing about it all is that not once since that morning has he paid the slightest attention to Cressy or the two dogs, except to growl a little when they have happened to meet. Turk must have told his companion about the fight, for he too finds attractions in another direction when he sees Hal coming. Some of our friends have found pleasure in teasing me about my sporting taste, private arena, and so on, but I do not mind so very much, since the fight brought about peace, and proved that Hal has plenty of pluck. Those two night dogs are looked upon as savage wolves by every mother in the garrison, and when it is known that they are out, mothers and nurses run to gather in their small people. Hal has developed a taste for hunting that has been giving trouble lately, when he has run off with Magic and the other hounds. So now he is chained until after guard mounting, by which time the pack has gone. The signal officer of the department was here the other day when Fay and men from the company were out signaling, and after luncheon I told West to go out to him on Powder Face and lead King, so he could ride the horse in, instead of coming in the wagon with the men. Late in the afternoon West came back, and reported that he had been unable to find Fay, and then, with much hesitation and choking, he told me that he had lost Hal. He said that as they had gone up a little hill, they had surprised a small band of antelope that were grazing rather near on the other side, and that the hound started after them like a streak, pulling one down before they had crossed the lowland, and then, not being satisfied, he had raced on again after the band that had disappeared over a hill further on. That was the last he saw of him. West said that he wanted to bring the dead antelope to the post, but could not, as both horses objected to it. My heart was almost broken over the loss of my dog, and I started for my own room to indulge in a good cry, when, as I passed the front door that was open, I happened to look out, and there, squatted down on the walk to the gate, was Hal. I ran out to pet him, but drew back in horror when I saw the condition he was in. His long nose and all of his white chest were covered with a thick coating of coarse antelope hair, plastered in with dried blood. The dog seemed too tired to move, and sat there with a listless, far-away look that made me wish he could tell me all about his hunt, and if he had lost the second poor little antelope. West almost danced from joy when he saw him, and lost no time in giving him a bath and putting him in his warm bed. Greyhounds are often great martyrs to rheumatism, and Deacon, one of the pack, will sometimes howl from pain after a hunt. And the howl of a greyhound is far-reaching and something to be remembered. Very soon now I will be with you. Faye has decided to close the house and live with the bachelors while I am away. This will be much more pleasant for him than staying here all alone. End of letter. Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory, October, 1873. The trip out was tiresome and seemed endless, but nothing worth mentioning happened until I got to Granada, where Faye met me with an ambulance and escort wagon. It was after 2 o'clock in the morning when the train reached the station, and as it is the terminus of the road, every passenger left the car. I waited a minute for Faye to come in, but as he did not, I went out also, feeling that something was wrong. Just as I stepped off the car, Mr. Davis, quartermaster's clerk, appeared and took my satchel, assuring me that Faye was right there waiting for me. This was so very unlike Faye's way of doing things that I at once suspected the real truth was not being told. But I went with him quickly through the little crowd and on up the platform, and then I saw Faye. He was standing at one corner of the building, all alone, and I recognized him instantly by the long light blue overcoat and big campaign hat with brim turned up. And I saw also, standing on the corner of the platform in front of him, a soldier with rifle in hand, and on the end of it, glistening in the moonlight, was a long bayonet. I had lived with troops long enough to know that the bayonet would not be there unless the soldier was a sentry guarding somebody or something. I naturally turned toward Faye, but was held back by Mr. Davis, and that made me indignant. But Faye at once said quietly and in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, "Get in the ambulance and ask no questions." And still he did not move from the corner. By this time I was terribly frightened and more puzzled. Drawn up close to the farther side of the platform was an ambulance, also an escort wagon, in which sat several soldiers, and handing my trunk checks to Mr. Davis, I got into the ambulance, my teeth chattering as though I had a chill. The very instant the trunks were loaded, Faye and the sentry came, and after ordering the corporal to keep his wagon and escort close to us, and telling me to drop down in the bottom of the ambulance if I heard a shot, Faye got on the ambulance also, but in front with the driver. Leaning forward, I saw that one revolver was in his hand and the other on the seat by his side. In this way, and in perfect silence, we rode through the town and until we were well out on the open plain, when we stopped just long enough for Faye to get inside, and a soldier from the wagon to take his seat by the driver. Then Faye told me of what had occurred to make necessary all these precautions. He had come over from Fort Lyon the day before, and had been with Major Carroll, the depot quartermaster, during the afternoon and evening. The men had established a little camp just at the edge of the miserable town, where the mules could be guarded and cared for. About 9 o'clock, Faye and Mr. Davis started out for a walk, but before they had gone far, Faye remembered that he had left his pistols and cartridge belt on a desk in the quartermaster's office, and fearing they might be stolen, they went back for them. He put the pistols on underneath his heavy overcoat, as the belt was quite too short to fasten outside. Well, He and Mr. Davis walked along slowly in the bright moonlight, past the many saloons and gambling places, never once thinking of danger, when suddenly, from a dark passageway, a voice said, "You are the man I want," and bang went a pistol shot close to Fay's head, so close, in fact, that as he ducked his head down when he saw the pistol pointed at him, the rammer slot struck his temple and cut a deep hole that at once bled profusely. Before Fay could get out one of his own pistols from underneath the long overcoat, another shot was fired, and then away skipped Mr. Davis, leaving Fay standing alone in the brilliant moonlight. As soon as Fay commenced to shoot, his would-be assassin came out from the dark doorway and went slowly along the walk, taking good care, however, to keep himself well in the shadow of the buildings. They went on down the street, shooting back and forth at each other, Fay wondering all the time why he could not hit the man. Once he got him in front of a restaurant window where there was a bright light back of him, and taking careful aim, he thought the affair could be ended right there, but the ball whizzed past the man and went crashing through the window and along the tables, sending broken china right and left. Finally their pistols were empty, and Fay drew out a second, at the sight of which the man started to run and disappeared in the shadows. As soon as the shooting ceased, men came out from all sorts of places, and there was soon a little crowd around Fay, asking many questions, but he and Major Carroll went to a drug store where his wounds could be dressed. For some time it was thought there must be a ball in the deep hole in his temple. When Fay had time to think, he understood why he had done such poor shooting. He is an almost sure shot, but always holds his pistol in his left hand, and of course aims with his left eye. But that night his left eye was filled with blood, the very first thing from the wound in his left temple, which forced him unconsciously to aim with his right eye, which accounts for the wild shots. The soldiers heard of the affair in camp, and several came up on a run and stood guard at the drug store. A rumor soon got around that Oliver had gone off to gather some of his friends, and they would soon be at the store to finish the work. Very soon, however, a strange man came in, much excited, and said, "Lieutenant, Oliver's pals are getting ready to attack you at the depot as the train comes in," and out he went. The train was due at 2:00 a.m., and this caused Fay 4 hours of anxiety. He learned that the man who shot at him was Billy Oliver, a horse thief and desperado of the worst type, and that he was the leader of a band of horse thieves that was then in town. To be threatened by men like those was bad enough in itself, but Fay knew that I would arrive on that train. That was the cause of so much caution when the train came in. There were several rough-looking men at the station, but if they had intended mischief, the long infantry rifles in the hands of drilled soldiers probably persuaded them to attend to their own affairs. A man told the corporal, however, that Oliver's friends had decided not to kill Fay at the station, but had gone out on horseback to meet him on the road. This was certainly misery prolonged. The mules were driven through the town at an ordinary gait, but when we got on the plain they were put at a run, and for miles we came at that pace. The little black shaved tails pulled the ambulance, and I think that, for once, they had enough run. The moonlight was wonderfully bright, and for a long distance objects could be seen, and bunches of sagebrush and Spanish bayonet took the forms of horsemen, and naturally I saw danger in every little thing we passed. One thing occurred that night that deserves mentioning. Some one told the soldiers that Oliver was hidden in a certain house, and one of them, a private, started off without leave and all alone for that house. When he got there the entire building was dark, not a light in it, except that of the moon which streamed in through 2 small windows. But the gritty soldier went boldly in and searched every little room and every little corner, even the cellar, but not a living thing was found. It may have been brave, but it was a dreadful thing for the trooper to do, for he so easily could have been murdered in the darkness, and Fay and the soldiers never have known what had become of him. Colonel Bissell declares that the man shall be made a corporal upon the first vacancy. The man Oliver was in the jail at Las Animas last summer for stealing horses. The old jail was very shaky, and while it was being made more secure, he and another man, a wife murderer, were brought to the guardhouse at this post. They finally took them back, and Oliver promptly made his escape, and the sheriff had actually been afraid to rearrest him. We have all begged Fay to get out a warrant for the man, but he says it would simply be a farce, that the sheriff would pay no attention to it. The whole left side of Fay's face is badly swollen and very painful, and the wound in his ankle compels him to use a cane. Just how the man managed to shoot Fay in the ankle no one seems to understand. Granada must be a terrible place. The very afternoon Fay was there a Mexican was murdered in the main street, but not the slightest attention was paid to the shooting. Everything went right on as though it was an everyday occurrence. The few respectable people are afraid even to try to keep order. Dodge City used to be that way, and there was a reign of terror in the town, until finally the 12 organized vigilantes became desperate and took affairs in their own hands. They notified 6 of the leading desperadoes that they must be out of the place by a certain day and hour. 4 went, but 2 were defiant and remained. When the specified hour had passed, 12 double-barreled shotguns were loaded with buckshot, and in a body the vigilantes hunted these men down as they would mad dogs, and riddled each one through and through with the big shot. It was an awful thing to do, but it seems to have been absolutely necessary, and the only way of establishing law and order. Our friends at Fort Dodge tell us that the place is now quite decent, and that a man can safely walk in the streets without pistols and a belt full of cartridges. End of letter. Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory, October, 1873. One naturally looks for all sorts of thrilling experiences when out on the frontier, but to have men and things mix themselves up in a maddening way in one's very own house, as has recently been done in mine, is something not usually counted upon. To begin with, Mrs. Ray is with us, and her coming was not only most unlooked for up to 2 days ago, but through a wretched mistake in a telegram, she got here just 24 hours before we thought she would arrive. Ordinarily this would have been a delightful surprise, but unfortunately things had begun to mix. Fay had suffered so much from the wound in his head that very little attention had been given the house since my return from the East. Therefore it was not in the very best of order. It was closed during my 2 months' absence, as Fay had lived down with the bachelors. The very day that Mrs. Ray came, the quartermaster had sent a man to repair one of the chimneys, and plaster and dirt had been left in my room, the one I had intended Mrs. Ray to occupy. And then, to make matters just as bad as possible, there was a sandstorm in the late afternoon that had, of course, sifted dust over all things. But this was not all. My nerves had not recovered from the shock at Granada, and had given out entirely that day just before dinner, and had sent me to bed with an uncomfortable chill. Still, I was not disheartened. Before I went East many things had been put away, but West had unpacked and polished the silver several days before, and the glass was shining, and the china closets in perfect order, all of which had been attended to with my own hands. Besides, the wife of one of the sergeants was to come the next morning to dust and clean the little house from top to bottom, so there was really nothing to worry about, as everything would be in order long before time for the stage to arrive that would bring Mrs. Ray. But after the chill came a fever, and with the fever came dreams, most disturbing dreams, in which were sounds of crunching gravel, then far-away voices, voices that I seemed to have heard in another world. A door was opened, and then, oh, how can I ever tell you? In the hall came Faye's mother. By that time dreams had ceased, and it was cruel reality that had to be faced. And even now I wonder how I lived through the misery of that moment. The longing to throw myself out of the window, jump in the river, do anything, in fact, but face the mortification of having her see the awful condition of her son's house. Her son's house, that was just it. I did not care at all for myself. My only thought was for Faye, whose mother might find cause to pity him for the delinquencies of his wife. First impressions are indelible, and it would be difficult to convince Mrs. Ray ever that the house was not always dusty and untidy. How could she know that with pride I had ever seen that our house, however rough it might have been, was clean and cheerful? And of what use would it be to arrange things attractively now? She would be justified in supposing that it was only in its company dress. I was weak and dizzy from fever and a sick heart, but I managed to get dressed and go down to do the best I could. West prepared a little supper, and we made things as comfortable as possible, considering the state of affairs. Mrs. Ray was most lovely about everything, said she understood it all, but that could not be, not until she had seen one of our sandstorms, from the dust of which it is impossible to protect a thing. I have been wishing for a storm ever since, so Mrs. Ray could see that I was not responsible for the condition of things that night. Now this was not all. Far, far from it. On the way out in the cars, Mrs. Ray met the colonel of the regiment, a real colonel, who is called a colonel too, who was also on his way to this post, and with him was Lieutenant Whittemore, a classmate of Faye's. Colonel Fitzjames was very courteous to Mrs. Ray, and when they reached Kit Carson, he insisted upon her coming over with him in the ambulance that had been sent to meet him. This was very much more comfortable than riding in the old stage, so she gladly accepted, and to show her appreciation of the kindness, she invited the colonel, also Lieutenant Whittemore, to dine with us the following evening. Yes, there is still more, for it so happens that Colonel Fitzjames is known to be an epicure, to be fussy and finical about all things pertaining to the table, and, what is worse, takes no pains to disguise it, and in consequence is considered an undesirable dinner guest by the most experienced housekeepers in the regiment. All this I had often heard, and recalled every word during the long hours of that night as I was making plans for the coming day. The combination in its entirety could not have been more formidable. There was Faye's mother, a splendid housekeeper, her very first day in our house, his colonel, and an abnormally sensitive palate, his very first meeting with each of us, his classmate, a young man of much wealth, a perfect stranger to me, a soldier cook, willing and a very good waiter, but only a plain, everyday cook, certainly not a maker of dainty dishes for a dinner party, and my own experiences in housekeeping had been limited to log huts in outlandish places. Every little thing for that dinner had to be prepared in our own house. There was no obliging caterer around the corner where a salad and ice and other things could be hurriedly ordered, not even one little market to go to for fish, flesh, or fowl, only the sutler's store, where their greatest dainty is cove oysters. Fortunately, there were some young grouse in the house which I had saved for Mrs. Ray, and which were just right for the table, and those West could cook perfectly. So, with a head buzzing from quinine, I went down in the morning, and with stubborn determination that the dinner should be a success, I proceeded to carry out the plans I had decided upon during the night. The house was put in splendid order, and the dinner prepared, and Colonel Knight was invited to join us. I attempted only the dishes that could be served well, nothing fancy or difficult, and the sergeant's wife remained to assist West in the kitchen. It all passed off pleasantly and most satisfactorily, and Colonel Fitzjames could not have been more agreeable, although he looked long and sharply at the soldier when he first appeared in the dining room. But he said not a word. Perhaps he concluded it must be soldier or no dinner. I have been told several nice things he said about that distracting dinner before leaving the garrison. But it all matters little to me now, since it was not found necessary to take me to a lunatic asylum. Mrs. Ray saw in a paper that Fay had been shot by a desperado, and was naturally much alarmed, so she sent a telegram to learn what had happened, and in reply Fay telegraphed for her to come out, and fearing that he must be very ill, she left Boston that very night. But we understood that she would start the next day, and this misinterpretation caused my undoing, that and the sandstorm. That man Oliver has at last been arrested, and is now in the jail at Las Animas, chained with another man, a murderer, to a post in the dark cellar. This is because he has so many times threatened the jailer. He says that someday he will get out, and then his first act will be to kill the keeper, and the next to kill Lieutenant Ray. He also declares that Fay kicked him when he was in the guardhouse at the post. Of course, anyone with a knowledge of military discipline would know this assertion to be false, for if Fay had done such a thing as that, he might have been court-martialed. The sheriff was actually afraid to make the arrest the first time he went over, because so many of Oliver's friends were in town, and so he came back without him, although he saw him several times. The second trip, however, Oliver was taken off guard and was handcuffed and out of the town before he had a chance to rally his friends to his assistance. He was brought to Las Animas during the night to avoid any possibility of a lynching. The residents of the little town are full of indignation that the man should have attempted to kill an officer of this garrison. He is a horse thief and desperado, and made his escape from their jail several months back, so altogether they consider the country can very well do without him. I think so too, and wish every hour in the day that the sheriff had been less cautious. Oliver cannot be tried until next May, when the general court meets, and I am greatly distressed over this fact, for the jail is old and most insecure, and he may get out at any time. The fear and dread of him is on my mind day and night. End of letter. Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory, December, 1873. Everyone in the garrison seems to be more or less in a state of collapse. The ball masque is over, the guests have departed, and all that is left to us now are the recollections of a delightful party that gave full return for our efforts to have it a success. We did not dream that so many invitations would be accepted at faraway posts, that parties would come from Fort Leavenworth, Fort Riley, Fort Dodge, and Fort Wallace, for a long ambulance ride was necessary from each place. But we knew of their coming in time to make preparations for all, so there was no confusion or embarrassment. Every house on the officers' line was filled to overflowing, and scarcely a corner left vacant. The new hospital was simply perfect for an elaborate entertainment. The large ward made a grand ballroom. The corridors were charming for promenading, and, yes, flirting, the dining room and kitchen perfect for the supper, and the office and other small rooms were a nice size for cloakrooms. Of course, each one of these rooms, big and small, had to be furnished. In each dressing room was a toilet table, fitted out with every little article that might possibly be needed during the evening, both before and after removal of masks. All this necessitated much planning, an immense amount of work, and the stripping of our own houses. But there were a good many of us, and the soldiers were cheerful assistants. I was on the supper committee, which really dwindled down to a committee of one at the very last, for I was left alone to put the finishing touches to the tables and to attend to other things. The vain creatures seemed more interested in their own toilets, and went home to beautify themselves. The commanding officer kept one eye, and the quartermaster about a dozen eyes upon us while we were decorating, to see that no injury was done to the new building. But that watchfulness was unnecessary, for the many high windows made the fastening of flags an easy matter, as we draped them from the casing of one window to the casing of the next, which covered much of the cold, white walls, and gave an air of warmth and cheeriness to the rooms. Accoutrements were hung everywhere, every bit of brass shining as only an enlisted man can make it shine, and the long infantry rifles with fixed bayonets were stacked wherever they would not interfere with the dancing. Much of the supper came from Kansas City, that is, the celery, fowls, and material for little cakes, ices, and so on, and the orchestra consisted of 6 musicians from the regimental band at Fort Riley. The floor of the ballroom was waxed perfectly, but it is hoped by some of us that much of the lightning will be taken from it before the hospital cots and attendants are moved in that ward. Everybody was en masque, and almost everyone wore fancy dress, and some of the costumes were beautiful. The most striking figure in the rooms, perhaps, was Lieutenant Alden, who represented Death. He is very tall and very slender, and he had on a skin-tight suit of dark brown drilling, painted from crown to toe with thick white paint to represent the skeleton of a human being. Even the mask that covered the entire head was perfect as a skull. The illusion was a great success, but it made one shiver to see the awful thing walking about, the grinning skull towering over the heads of the tallest, and ever at its side was a red devil, also tall, and so thin one wondered what held the bones together. This red thing had a long tail. The devil was Lieutenant Perkins, of course. Fay and Dr. Dent were dressed precisely alike as sailors, the doctor even wearing a pair of Fay's shoes. They had been very sly about the twin arrangement, which was really splendid, for they are just about the same size and have hair very much the same color. But smart as they were, I recognized Fay at once. The idea of anyone thinking I would not know him! We had queens and milkmaids and flower girls galore, and black starry nights and silvery days, and all sorts of things, many of them very elegant. My old yellow silk, the 2 black lace flounces you gave me, and a real Spanish mantilla that Mrs. Ray happened to have with her made a handsome costume for me as a Spanish lady. I wore almost all the jewelry in the house, every piece of my own small amount, and much of Mrs. Ray's, the nicest of all having been a pair of very large, old-fashioned hoop earrings, all set around with brilliants. My comb was a home product, very showy, but better left to the imagination. The dancing commenced at 9 o'clock, and at 12 supper was served, when we unmasked, and after supper we danced again, and kept on dancing until 5 o'clock. Even then a few of us would have been willing to begin all over, for when again could we have such a ballroom with perfect floor and such excellent music to dance by? But with the new day came a new light, and all was changed, much like the change of a ballet with a new calcium light, only ours was not beautifying, but most trying to tired, painted faces, and seeing each other we decided that we could not get home too fast. In a few days the hospital will be turned over to the post surgeon, and the beautiful ward will be filled with iron cots and sick soldiers, and instead of delicate perfumes, the odor of nauseous drugs will pervade every place. I have been too busy to ride during the past week, but am going out this afternoon with the chaplain's young daughter, who is a fearless rider, although only 14. King is very handsome now, and his gait delightful, but he still requires most careful management. He ran away with me the other day, starting with those 3 tremendous strides, but we were out on a level and straight road, so nothing went wrong. All there was for me to do was to keep my seat. Lieutenant Perkins and Miss Campbell were a mile or more ahead of us, and after he had passed them he came down to a trot, evidently flattering himself that he had won a race, and that nothing further was expected of him. He jumps the cavalry hurdles beautifully, goes over like a deer, Hal always following directly back of him. Whatever a horse does, that dog wants to do also. Last spring, when we came up from Camp Supply, he actually tried to eat the corn that dropped from King's mouth as he was getting his supper one night in camp. He has scarcely noticed Powder Face since the very day King was sent to me, but became devoted to the new horse at once. I wonder if he could have seen that the new horse was the faster of the two. End of letter. End of section 6.